Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. My guest today is McFaul. He served as U.S. ambassador to Russia under President Obama from 2012 to 2014. He's now a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor of political science at Stanford University in California, where he joins us from. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Mr. McFaul, you just published a book. It's called From Cold War to Hot Peace. Russia obviously is in the spotlight right now for hosting the Soccer World Cup in a display of what some call soft power. But the big talk in Washington and in Moscow is about a potential meeting, a potential summit between both presidents, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Do you think the conditions are ripe for such a top-level meeting?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. I think the World Cup is going splendidly well for Russia and splendidly well for Mexico, by the way, I should add, in their fantastic victory over Germany yesterday. But it does show the real Russia, bigger Russia, a Russia I know well, and I'm glad to see that other people can see the country of Russia and the people of Russia, not just the government. With respect to the summit, I generally believe in engagement. I think it's important for leaders to meet. I think that it's the greatest sin of diplomacy to have a conflict based on misperception or bad information. What I'm worried about in this particular meeting is the peculiar style of President Trump in meeting with autocratic leaders around the world. I worry that he won't come prepared for the meeting to achieve American national security objectives, which should always be at the top of the list for any president, but instead he'll seek a good relationship, a friendly relationship, and we'll see all kinds of praise for President Putin, like he did with the North Korean leader, without any results. And that, to me, does not serve American national interests. So I hope, if it happens, that he'll be much more prepared and to try to achieve concrete American objectives.
Right. I mean, there seems also to be differences, at least within the administration. Obviously, Donald Trump suggested recently going back to the G8. We heard his defense secretary, Jim Mattis, telling graduates of the Naval War College just a few days ago that Vladimir Putin aims to diminish, I quote, the appeal of Western democratic model and attempts to undermine America's moral authority. Do you think there are tensions over Russia policy within the administration?
Yes. In fact, I think there are two policies towards Russia in the Trump administration. On the one hand, the Trump administration has a lot of consensus, and I would say there's a lot of continuity with the Trump administration's policy and Obama administration policy, which is to push back on Russia, strengthen NATO, sanction those that were involved with seizing, annexing Crimea and invading eastern Ukraine, and to try to strengthen Ukraine. And in some instances, the Trump administration has gone farther than the Obama administration, for instance, in providing lethal assistance to Ukraine. But President Trump doesn't agree with that policy. It's clear to me that he does not sign up to that policy. He reluctantly puts sanctions in. He wants to be friends with Putin. And as you just pointed out of the blue, from what I understand, he just said on the eve of the G7 summit that Russia should be included back in. As far as I know, there's not another senior Trump administration official who supports that policy. So I've never seen anything like this, by the way, where you have the president with one policy and the rest of his administration with another.
Right. I mean, obviously, there is this obsession probably for President Trump, the investigation by special prosecutor Robert Mueller into potential collusion with Russia that's hanging over a shadow. Obviously, you were in Moscow. I mean, do you think that indeed this is something that could be dangerous for President Trump and maybe explain his behavior, a behavior that's not necessarily in line with other people within the administration?
It could be. I don't know the answer to that. I think that's why we need Robert Mueller to finish his work. I do know a few things. I do know, for instance, that Vladimir Putin most certainly wanted Trump as president over Secretary Clinton. By the way, that's very rational because candidate Trump said things that were in Putin's and Russia's national interest as defined by Putin. He said he would look into recognizing Crimea as part of Russia. He would look into lifting sanctions. He was very critical of NATO. And he never used the words democracy or human rights to talk about Russia. Second, we know clearly that Putin intervened in our elections to try to help Trump win. He stole emails from the Democratic Party and published them in a way that was negative for Secretary Clinton. He used his media platforms and his bots and trolls to help candidate Trump. And he sent his emissaries to meet with the Trump campaign to allegedly provide information, disinformation, kompromat, as they say in Russian, on candidate Clinton. What we don't know is, does he have compromising material on either President Trump or his family?
There was this famous dossier that's been in the news out there.
Right, but you know, I've read the dossier closely, but what I have not seen is definitive information that either that is some compromising information on President Trump or some financial leverage on the Trump Association. Those are the two questions that Mr. Mueller needs to answer in the future.
Just to go back in time and go back to your book, you've described it in an interview as, quote unquote, a tragedy. I mean, back in 2010, there was the famous reset. It seemed to be underway, but things unraveled, and especially when you were appointed in early 2002, it immediately got very personal for you when you set foot in Moscow.
It did, and you're right. People forget, and that's part of the reason I wrote the book, by the way, to remind people that we have had cooperative periods with the Kremlin over 30 years. The last major cooperative period was during the reset, as you pointed out. And for about 3 or 4 years there, we were doing major things with then President Medvedev and President Obama. We signed a new START treaty, reducing by 30% the number of nuclear weapons allowed in the world. We signed up to new sanctions on Iran. We got Russia into the World Trade Organization. We opened up a new supply route towards Afghanistan. And back then, in 2010, a majority of Russians had a positive view of the United States, and a majority of Americans had a positive view of Russia. What happened, I think, are two things. One, President Putin came back, decided to run for president again, and it turns out he had a much more negative view about the United States than President Medvedev. He sees the world in zero-sum terms. And number two, there were massive demonstrations against the Putin regime that began in December 2011 after a falsified vote there. And so to mobilize his base, to mobilize his supporters, he blamed us, America, Obama, and
you
me.
personally. I mean, there were very direct attacks
yes.
against you and your family, correct?
Well, that's right. I mean, in terms of the national media, even before my first day at work, by the way, it was on the weekend I arrived in Moscow, there was a major hit piece on me describing me as a fomenter of revolution, and that I was sent by Obama to lead this revolution to help the opposition to overthrow Putin. And then it did get personal from time to time. The worst for me was when a video started to circulate accusing me of being a pedophile. And, you know, how do you respond to that? What
this
do you
was
say
engineered
to that?
by the Kremlin, by Putin directly, you think?
Well, you never know that. That's an important distinction. There's always cutouts. There's always, by the way, like the intervention in 2016 in our elections, Putin's too clever to do things directly. But were there proxies that did it? My answer to that is yes. Did the Kremlin criticize it? They didn't criticize it. And I think that demonstrates a lot about what they were seeking to achieve.
Right. I mean, obviously, there have been a number of issues between Russia and the West. The poisoning of the Skripals in the UK, massive expulsion of diplomats, and some have wondered whether the Cold War is back. Is this what you feel?
Well, I deliberately titled my book From Cold War to Hot Peace.
Right.
To suggest that there's some parallels to the Cold War. And in fact, you know, I think you have to go pretty deep into the Cold War to remember a confrontational time like we have today. But I use this other phrase, hot peace, because some aspects of our conflict, I think, are different. And some of those are less confrontational and some of them are more. On the more side, let's remember, during the Cold War, we did not have annexation. Today, that's back. That's something we thought we got rid of after World War II. That's back. That's something new. Today, during the hot peace, we have the Kremlin orchestrating, direct meddling in our electoral decision-making in 2016. That also didn't happen during the Cold War. And as you mentioned, the Skripal poisoning, again, we don't know exactly if Putin was involved in that, but Prime Minister May has made it pretty clear that she is blaming the Kremlin. That also is a violation of British sovereignty that you really didn't have during the Cold War. So there are some elements that are better than the Cold War. We're not having a giant ideological struggle between communism and capitalism. But there are some elements in the hot peace that are worse than the Cold War.
Okay, Ambassador McFaul, thank you very much for your time. And thank you for watching this edition of The Interview here on France 24.